Okay, hello everybody and welcome to the Test Management with TestRail webinar. I am the TestRail Product Manager, Simon Knight. All right, so without further ado, let's get started. So this webinar is about test management and more specifically, what is test management in TestRail? So those are questions that I'm going to be seeking to try and provide answers to during the course of the webinar. And I think that the first one is relatively simple. What is test management? So let's start with that. For the purpose of this webinar, I'm going to define test management as the process of delivering the set of testing activities that are necessary for mitigating quality and other risks as they relate to the successful development and release of a given product. That's a bit of a mouthful. So the set of testing activities necessary to support the successful release of a product is a little bit more manageable. And that's what I'm going to go with. Probably or maybe some of you might object to that definition, and that's fine. Some of you may adhere to a more formal kind of ISTQB definition, or on the other end of the spectrum, some of you may be more context driven, or you may be in the middle somewhere, adhering more to a kind of modern testing point of view, and that's all fine. All I'm really saying here is that test management is test planning, design, test execution, test maintenance, and all of the other stuff that is required to deliver a successful and rigorous testing service. And all of those things are activities that TestRail is designed to help you with, and items that to some extent I will try and cover during the course of this webinar. So I'm just going to start off with a brief segue into requirements before we get into the nuts and bolts of test management though. Probably you're all familiar with requirements. They come in many different shapes and forms. They might be in a document, or they might be in some kind of ticketing system such as Jira or Assembler or Trello, or there's lots of others out there. So I'm going to start by saying up front, TestRail does not directly support requirements. You can't easily enter requirements directly into TestRail for the purposes of linking them to your test cases. TestRail is a test case management system. It's not a requirements management system. That being said, TestRail does integrate with a huge number of requirements management tools, and the integration and configuration of those tools is very easy in almost all cases. So whether you're using an external system such as Jira or Assembler, for example, or whether you're using some other mechanism such as Excel or Word documents, TestRail will support you with tracing your test cases back to those requirements. And in my mind, it makes very good sense to reference requirements wherever you have them, so that you have that traceability back to any relevant documentation that is being used to inform the scope and the design of your test cases. How those requirements are themselves organized into deliverables, milestones, releases, sprints, iterations, how those things are organized can also help to inform how you organize and subsequently report on your testing activities and the results of those activities in TestRail, namely through the use of test cases, test runs, test plans, and milestones. So if you do have some form of requirements documentation in the form of a formal requirements document, or in tickets rather, not tissues, sorry, or issues, such as in Jira, when you're creating your test cases, you can reference those items in the test case reference fields, as I'm showing here. And if you have tooling integrated with TestRail, then in most cases, what's going to happen when you add your references to your requirements in the test case references field is it's going to result in a link directly to that requirement, which you can then either hover over to pull information into TestRail from your integrated tool. So it could be Jira, it could be something else, whatever. Or you can just click on the link and that's going to navigate you directly to that requirement. And if you're using Jira or Assembler, then you can even go a step further and you can create and track your cases, your tests, and your runs inside of Jira or inside of Assembler, as you can see from these images here. And if you want to, you can also add references to your test runs and to your milestones as well. So you can cover all of your requirements either at test case level or at test run level, or you can link them to your milestones. You can also, as of a recent release, I forget exactly which one, you can add references to runs in configuration-based test plans as well. So that's kind of how we handle requirements inside of TestRail. And wherever it's possible to do so, I think you should aim to reference your requirements on your test cases, since this is ultimately going to help you to demonstrate how your cases cover those requirements during any subsequent reporting on your testing. And this principle of traceability is going to hold true for whatever approach or methodology you're using for your testing. So whether you're using some flavor of waterfall, agile, or some brand of DevOps or continuous delivery, continuous testing, adding those references to your test cases is always going to help you better understand what areas your test cases do and don't cover. While we're touching on methodology, let's talk a little bit about what TestRail templates are most useful and appropriate for which development methodology and testing approach combination. So out of the box, TestRail is going to provide you with 3 templates that you can use for your testing. And each of them is going to be more or less suited to a particular kind of approach. Generally speaking, if you're following more of a waterfall approach, then you might find that the use of our test case steps template is going to be more useful. If you're scripting your cases up front, as in my experience is kind of what you do during waterfall development, then using a test case with steps, using our test case steps template is going to give you a lot of flexibility about how you define your test scripts. It's going to enable you to decompose your scripts into steps and expected results. It's going to empower you. It's going to give you the capability to record and report on each step individually under the umbrella of your test case. And it's going to really, I think, where this really comes into its own is it's going to give you the best framework for using those test cases with business users when, later down the line, you want to do things like user acceptance testing or operational acceptance testing, UAT and OAT, respectively. If you're using more of a scrum or agile approach, where you're testing in sprints, cycles, or iterations, then the use of the exploratory session template may be preferred. The exploratory session template gives you a loose framework for specifying your expected test coverage up front by filling out the details of your testing mission, the objective, the risks that you want to address, or the areas that you want to explore during the course of your testing. And you can use the goals field in the exploratory session template to further decompose the kind of parameters of the testing session. Exploratory sessions in TestRail correspond very closely with exploratory testing as it's discussed by various folk in the testing field. So people like James Whittaker in his book Exploratory Testing, James Bucks, session-based test management, James Lindsay's thread-based testing. Isn't it weird how they all have James as their first name? I've only just noticed that. Anyway, there's probably lots of other folk who have resources around exploratory testing whose names don't begin with James. And if you want some more information about how to manage an exploratory testing approach in a general sense, then by all means go and check some of those sources out. But basically, I think at a super high level, the approach that you want to follow with exploratory testing is identify some set of exploratory testing coverage. So think about the kind of stuff that you want to cover off, and then the general approach to execution is to kind of execute that initial set of session-based tests, exploratory tests, and then iterate on your testing as you learn more about your product, about the system you're testing, based on the test results of your initial exploratory testing cycle. In my mind, exploratory testing has a number of benefits over writing detailed test scripts in advance of your testing. So you spend less time up front writing out all of those scripts, and it can benefit you in terms of widening the scope of your testing if you need to. So from more of a DevOps or a continuous approach, I mean, the main distinction that I'm drawing for the purposes of this webinar between the various development methods is the kind of diminishing release artifact size. So when you're doing a waterfall project, the release artifact is big. It comes in a big bang. When you're doing agile or scrum-based development, the release artifact is a little bit smaller because you're delivering your releases in smaller cycles, often 2-week or 4-week cycles. And if you're following a DevOps approach, then the release artifact is likely to be even smaller, much smaller. It could be a single pull request, and that release candidate, the release artifact, could go out hourly, daily, in much tighter development cycles. So when it comes to DevOps or continuous testing, I'm also kind of assuming that you're following more of an automated approach to your testing, although you may well blend in some manual testing effort as well. But when you're using TestRail for continuous automated testing, then most likely you're going to be using cases in TestRail as placeholders for the testing that is actually being carried out by your test automation framework. And as such, you can just use the default test case text template to name your test cases and store any additional information that's required for your testing efforts, any metadata and stuff like that. And then when it comes to test execution, you can just create a test run and update the cases in that run using the TestRail API. And I should probably mention just before moving on from templates that you can create your own test case templates as well with any custom fields or custom settings that you wish if the out of the box templates don't quite fit your context or the way in which you work. So these are just some suggestions as to how to use the templates that we provide you with TestRail out of the box. No matter what development methodology or template you're actually using for your testing, when it comes to organizing your test cases in TestRail, I think there's some general principles that you should follow and that we've found work for TestRail customers over the course of time. So generally speaking, we recommend organizing your tests by component or functional area or feature. TestRail sections can be organized and subsections in pretty much any way you want. So you should be able to find a way to do this that aligns with how your product is structured. Personally, I really like to see priorities on test cases, and I would recommend doing the same. Test case priorities can be further used to organize your cases, and obviously at runtime as well, you can make decisions about how you're going to execute your tests based on the prioritization that you've assigned to them. And there's lots of other fields in TestRail that you can use as well to further refine or filter your cases. So the type field, for example. And as I already mentioned, if you need to, you can always create additional fields and templates to better suit the specifics of your team or your methodology. So my advice here really is to experiment and see what works best for you, but bear in mind that probably the most sustainable approach to managing your test cases is going to be organizing them by component or functional area. Okay, so excuse me. Once you've actually got your test cases created, excuse me, frog in my throat. Once you've got your test cases created for the scope of the testing that you want to do, and assuming that you're ready to actually do that testing, then you're probably ready to start creating some test runs and actually start executing your tests. Once again, the specifics of how you actually define a test run is going to vary somewhat based on your methodology, whether you're waterfall, whether you're some flavor of agile, whether you're continuous delivery, but not as much as you might think. If you're using a waterfall-based approach, then you're probably going to be testing a lot of functionality at once. As I mentioned earlier, waterfall, big bang, lots of functionality. TestRail gives you lots of options for how you can handle those tests. You could just include all of your tests that you want to execute in a single run, and then use assignment or filtering to control how those tests are sequenced. So you can see here, I've sequenced my test by priority because I like to see prioritized test cases. Obviously, you might have a slightly different approach, and as I mentioned, there's plenty of fields that you can use in TestRail to supply the data to your test cases, and you can then use that to organize how they're actually executed, including assigning them to specific people within your team. Alternatively, you can create several runs and split them up according to different areas of functionality. So in this picture here, I have created a test plan, and what I want to do is run the same set of tests across the different browsers that I support. So that's another approach that you could take. Split your test cases up and run them across a number of different runs or as part of a plan, selecting specific sections or cases, and again, applying filters as needed. Probably an approach that I'd recommend from a waterfall perspective is creating runs according to the type of testing that you're doing. So you can see here I've got a bunch of runs and a couple of plans, because in my experience of delivering waterfall projects, you tend to have lots of different testing cycles. So I might have a couple of different functional testing cycles, cycle 1, cycle 2, and then I might do some regression testing once development is finished, and then I might go into things like UAT and OAT, as I mentioned earlier. So that's another way that you can organize and sequence your tests using runs and plans. You could also, instead of having all of your tests inside a single run sorted by priority, you could create a plan and a run for each level of priority. I probably wouldn't do this, to be honest, but you know, this is just to demonstrate that TestRail is very flexible about how you organize and manage your testing. Speaking as a product manager, I always like to see all of the runs and plans that are being executed associated with a milestone that corresponds to a release in TestRail. That way I can go to the milestone and see exactly what testing is planned for the release, exactly what testing is in progress for the release, and what the status of that testing is, all in one place without having to go digging around for it. If I know I've got a release, all of the testing is in that release milestone. I can just go straight to it and see exactly what's going on. And the same kind of principles are going to apply when creating runs on an agile project. They're just going to be a bit smaller or tighter because the methodology is geared towards smaller, more incremental deliverables. And you should organize your test runs according to the testing that you want to do. In my experience of delivering agile testing projects, often that boils down to feature testing throughout the course of the sprint, and I'd often organize that as a number of small runs in a plan, focusing on the specific features that are being developed, often being tested while still on a feature branch of the code. Then, or in parallel, I'd have an exploratory testing run that was being used to carry out testing as features are being merged into the master branch. So look for integration and other issues that are being caused by interactions between the different areas of the code, the different features that are being merged together into that master build. And then, of course, automated regression testing throughout the sprint with new tests being added as features are implemented. That to me is a kind of classical agile sprint-based test approach. Obviously, your mileage may vary, but that's one approach that you could take. Just touching on test automation, there's lots of ways you can set up your automated test runs as well. In my experience of talking to TestRail customers, the most common and intuitive approach is just to create a test run each time you execute your test automation and record your results against that. It's possible that you may want to keep your automated test runs outside your project milestones. There's a strong likelihood that your automation is going to be running throughout the entire life cycle of your project. Your automation isn't running on a sprint basis. It's kind of continuous, and it's something that's going to grow and evolve over the course of your entire project. So it doesn't necessarily make sense to record them under the umbrella of specific sprint release milestones in the same way as you might do all of your other tests. But you can do it if you wish, and if it's helpful to see the results of those automated test runs for your release milestones. I think one of the main benefits of using milestones and plans in TestRail is that it aggregates all of your result metrics for reporting purposes. So you can use a plan under your project to capture all of your test automation results if you wish, and you can get the same kind of benefit. All of those automation runs are being grouped in a plan, which means you have a dashboard that aggregates the results of all of those automated runs, if that's information that's useful to you. Just a quick note, remember to close your runs once they're finished. That helps to keep TestRail working nice and quickly. So moving on to DevOps, continuous delivery type approaches. Honestly, there's not a huge amount of surprises in terms of how to organize your runs for your DevOps or your continuous delivery testing approach either. It's going to be organized in much the same kind of way. The main distinction here is probably how those runs are actually going to be created, because if you're on the sort of continuous delivery end of the software development spectrum, then ideally you should be automating a lot of your testing. And to the extent that your tests are being automated, then you're going to be using the TestRail API to do a lot of your heavy lifting. TestRail's got a really full and very flexible API with a huge number of endpoints that you can use to bolster your test automation efforts in pretty much any way you want. But from a very basic perspective, you can accomplish the vast majority of what you need to accomplish with your test automation using just a couple of endpoints and calls. You can use the add run endpoint to create a run in your project and pass in the IDs of the test cases that you want to execute in the scope of that test run. And then you can use the add results for cases endpoint to add the results for the cases in your run. And that's it, you're done. Using those API endpoints, you can also pass in information about milestones. So again, if you wish, to the extent it's helpful, you can track all of those runs against a release or a sprint. And you can also add references to your requirements in those runs in the same way as you can for cases as well, as I mentioned earlier. So using this approach, the add results for cases API endpoint approach, you can also do things like drill down into the test cases to see how they've performed over time, and you can generate reports in TestRail along the same lines. It's also a very performant way of using the TestRail API. Some teams may prefer to update test or case results individually, so sending a request to the API, posting the result for each test as it's being executed. And obviously that does have the benefit of providing you with those results in real time. But honestly, I think for most people, that's kind of overkill. And if you're looking at those results in TestRail, you're still going to have to refresh the page at present. At least we may change that in the future. But in order to see those results in real time, you're just going to have to keep refreshing the page or pull them back out of TestRail using the API anyway. So using a bulk API endpoint to put all of your results into TestRail in one go is, in my opinion, a much easier and more performant way of using the TestRail API for your test automation. Okay, so I mean, I've touched on test plans and milestones a little bit throughout the course of the webinar. The use of plans and milestones to kind of organize your testing, to manage your testing efforts is entirely optional. From a TestRail functional perspective, you can just use test cases and test runs. But like I said earlier, organizing your runs into plans and milestones does generate a few benefits for your status and reporting efforts. Like I said earlier, the main benefit of organizing your runs into a plan is that once you've done so, all of your testing metrics from those runs is going to roll up into that plan, consolidating all of the metrics from your cases into one place. So what that means is if you want to see the status, the activity, the progress, or defect metrics for all of your test runs in one place, then you can do so either by creating those runs in a plan or by using milestones. And if anything, milestones might be a little bit more user-friendly with plans, since you can retrospectively add runs and plans to milestones, whereas you can't with plans. The other benefit of using plans and milestones is all of the additional reporting options that you get by doing so. So for runs, plans, and milestones, you have the option of using the print button for a report of all of your tests in the run, the plan, or the milestone. For plans and milestones, that simple print report option is also going to give you all of the test results for all of the runs in a plan and all runs and plans in a milestone, respectively. And you've also got the option of navigating directly to dedicated reports from your plans and milestones. So you can generate a summary report for the level you're at. You can report on your testing results, comparing them across cases, references, or by your own selected property. And using this approach, when you navigate to your reports directly from a milestone in this case, then TestRail does a bit more of the report configuration work for you by automatically populating the report settings based on the TestRail view that you navigated to that report from. Okay. So what I've tried to do during the webinar thus far is kind of run through how you can think about test management based on how TestRail functions in terms of workflows and what testing looks like, in my experience, depending on what methodology you're using. So waterfall, agile, or continuous delivery. And as you can see, they're pretty similar. The main difference is the feedback loop, but the basic structure of how you're going to handle these different development methodologies within TestRail is much the same. You've got your requirements linked to test cases. Your test cases are executed in runs, organized as you need to for your specific context, and then group all of that information under a release version, a milestone, and further group it into plans if necessary. And it's the same for agile, and it's the same for continuous, just, you know, potentially less organization into test runs and things like that, because of the shorter feedback loops. I've talked about traceability and how, as a kind of general principle, it's always going to be really helpful if you can trace your tests back to a specific artifact, a specific requirement, and those can be formal requirements in, you know, Word documents or whatever. They could be tickets, issues, features, epics. They could even be pull requests in a continuous delivery worldview. We've also talked a bit about how TestRail helps and guides you in respect of designing your test cases through the use of templates, and how you can then organize those cases for execution and subsequent reporting in runs, plans, and milestones. Creating and organizing your tests in this way is going to help you to maintain and reuse your test cases and your test runs and plans over the course of time, should you need to. And I talked quite briefly about how you can use TestRail's API to facilitate automated testing, test reporting very quickly and easily, using just a couple of endpoints if you wish. We've also talked quite a bit about how you can roll up the results of all your tests into more easily digestible dashboards and reports by consolidating your runs into plans and milestones. So in summary, if you're using TestRail, then the organization of your testing assets is gonna look broadly similar as we saw on the previous view, right? Because of how TestRail works to make your life as simple and easy as possible. It gives you the tools that you need to create your test cases and to manage the execution of those test cases in runs, plans, and milestones. And we leave the rest to you. We try to keep things very simple and flexible in TestRail because we know that our customers appreciate that. Obviously, how you actually execute your testing is going to be a little bit different depending on the development methodology being used, and any other differences based on, you know, your organization or your culture or the specifics of your team that you're working on. So just to conclude, if you're mainly using a waterfall approach, use references to provide requirements traceability on your test cases. You could use the test case steps template as a go-to template for test cases that are being scripted up front before actually starting your test execution. You should organize your runs, I would suggest, according to testing activities, functional testing, regression, UAT, things like that, and organize your runs into plans and use milestones to aggregate and report on your test progress and your results more easily. If you're mainly using an agile or a scrum approach, use references again to provide feature and epic traceability on your test cases. Epic traceability, I like that. Use exploratory session templates to create your exploratory tests. Leverage dynamic filtering to facilitate iterative testing. I didn't really talk about dynamic filtering, but you can use dynamic filters when creating your test runs as well. And again, Milestones and sprints have a kind of natural mapping, so use it, leverage it to organize and report on your testing quickly and easily. And if you're delivering continuously, first off, well done, great job. Use references to provide ticket or pull request traceability on your test cases. Use test case text templates as placeholders for your automated tests. Use the TestRail API to create test runs and report on your automated testing results. And again, roll up your test runs into milestones for easier reporting. Alrighty, and that's the bulk of the presentation out of the way. So I think we do have some time for Q&A. So what's on the board? Let's take a look.
I've got plenty of questions that I've thrown in the Slack channel here. See, can we use the same test cases for both manual and automated testing? And if so, which template is preferred? There's not really a specific template. You can kind of use either one. If you want to, do you have anything you want to say there, Simon?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily recommend a template. Probably if I was going to use the same test case for both manual and automated testing, I would either be inclined to use the test case text template, because that's just going to kind of give you the most sort of flexibility about how you capture the information about the testing that you actually want to do. And classically for that kind of testing, I'd be inclined to sort of specify my tests using a BDD kind of format, which works really well because that's obviously something that you can use to express your actual requirements as scenarios, as examples of the kind of behavior that you want to see in your product. And then obviously those scenarios can be used to carry out some degree of acceptance testing against the finished solution, either manually or in an automated fashion if you've implemented some code to actually execute the various scenarios that you've designed. But the short answer to that question is yes, you can certainly use the same test case for both manual and automated testing.
Cool. All right, expanding on how you would build a feature run would be great. Do you have a way to tag test cases that apply to a particular feature, or would the person building that run just need to be familiar with the cases? What's the best way to do this? Typically, I would suggest using custom fields, potentially a multi-select field that could then be used when creating your test run using filtering. So if you have like a multi-select field where you enter all of the different features that you're going to be testing against, and then on each test case you can you can configure each of those different each of the different features that test case applies to. Then when you're creating a new run, you would simply use the filtering option and say, oh, I want to do a feature run based around authentication, and then every test case that you have that has that multi-select option of authentication would be included inside of that test run. I think that's how I would set it up. I don't know if there's other potential ways that people might want to do that, but
so you're talking about adding a custom field, Jacob, with a multi-select?
Yeah, I would typically do multi-select just in case because in a lot of the time, rather than like a traditional drop-down, you might have test cases that have a little bit of overlap. They might be partially like an authentication thing, or like you can have test cases that just might fit into one or more different categories. So using the multi-select field allows you to cover your bases a little bit more on what type of a feature it's actually being like testing itself.
Yeah. Yeah. I wouldn't necessarily argue with that. I think another way that you could approach that is just by organizing your test cases by component, functionality or feature as well. So, I mean, you can see here, I haven't been particularly descriptive with the names, but I've got a few folders, a few sections with covering with test cases for specific features. And you can see each of those test cases references the requirement from which that test case has been derived. So a requirement or a feature or a story, whatever this might be. So you've got your references in there. And then, I mean, as Jacob mentioned, there's lots of ways that you could create test runs. One of the ways that you could create those runs is as a plan with runs for each of the specific features that you want to test in it. So you could take an approach like that as well. I mean, it just depends on how you want to split stuff up, and you may choose to take this approach because you want to assign each of these runs to a different tester potentially, but equally you could have all of these cases inside a single run and assign them by feature or any other parameter that you want to use inside of a single run as well. So
cool. All right. What is the value with different test case templates? I did not quite get it. What way is it different? So the two I think that Simon really touched on today are the kind of default test case text template and then the test case steps template. Just from a very broad perspective, the value of test case templates is just choosing what fields and what data you want to store within that particular test case. If you can build your own custom templates and you can add your own custom fields, and if some of those fields apply to test cases that wouldn't necessarily apply to others, then having multiple templates available so you can say, okay, this is going to be my template for these types of regression tests or something similar like that, where you have a very specific layout and field selection that you want to be available for that type of test case, is going to be the best option for you. That way you can have multiple different test types that have different fields available to them. That said, with the default ones, as Simon was describing, you've got the test case steps and the test case text. Steps do allow you to essentially just add individual steps, as Simon's demonstrating right now. So with the test case text, you really just have one large login screen, or excuse me, one large text field for all of your different steps. Read the word login screen as he was typing. So you would just have one text field for all of the information that Simon is filling out right now. Whereas when you're using the steps template as here, you can add individual what each step is doing, and then with the expected result for that step. And then when you're executing these tests, you will be able to kind of add a pass or fail for each individual step along the way to really get a little bit more granular with how this test is functioning. So that's the main value of this particular test template. But from a broad perspective, it's really just being able to design tests for any number of scenarios given what fields would be available on them. So as Simon's showing here, when you go in to execute this test and add a result, he will be able to add a pass fail for each of these individual steps, just to kind of show where, if there is a problem, where it's happening. It also does, it's supposed to change the status. I think the search there might have affected the way that functions, but you can actually also enter an actual result for each of these as well. So if you did notice that one of your steps failed or something else happened, you can go in and add a specific result, add images to it, do attachments, all that kind of fun stuff. All right. Yep, there you go. So now you've got a failed test that has all of the individual steps, kind of marking what occurred within that testing. All right. This question: can you export a test plan per project to PDF Word? Same for test report. There's not anything to allow you to export to Word currently. I think that's something that we're sort of exploring for later on down the line, but definitely not anytime soon. I think, but right now you can use this print option, and you should be able to print to PDF, which is usually the best way to create these kinds of things. So within the print option, as Simon's demonstrating here, you can go to details rather than the outline option, and this is going to show you really just everything in the instance when you're looking at the details. Outline is just going to give you more of a broad overview, but this, once you click that print option, you should have the option to print to PDF, and then just save that locally or share it around. Within the reporting system, all of the built-in reports can be set up for PDF as well. So you can have those emailed out as PDF reports or just within the system, and when they're generated, you can download them as a PDF. So there's not any, you can, just kind of export from here to a PDF to download that PDF directly, to keep everything together that way. All right, what is the value with different, oh, okay, we already covered that one.
Just while we're touching on reports, there was a question that came in earlier as well about how to cover off requirements for ISO purposes. I think it was from somebody who tests medical devices and things like that. So, I mean, I've set up some stuff in my example instance here. I mean, you can see it's fairly sort of basic in terms of what I've actually set up. It's just intended to kind of give you an idea of how you might go about doing some of this stuff. But if I go into my functional test run here, then you can see that I've got a plan basically of all of the tests that I want to execute in that run. And these tests have been run, these ones haven't been. I can assign, let's just organize this by assign to. So I can go ahead and assign those tests to the various people on my team. That's just me at present. So from a sort of planning perspective, just looking at these views is going to give you a goodish amount of information about what your testing plan actually looks like. And obviously you can organize this in various different ways. As I mentioned several times, I'm a big fan of prioritizing my testing for obvious reasons. But you can add different columns, so you can display the data that you want to see in this view. You can add custom fields, as Jacob mentioned as well. So all of those custom fields would be available to you as columns that you can add to this view as well. And ultimately, I think you know, in answer to that question, I can't remember exactly what the question was, but I think it was something along the lines of, I have to report on my test plan for ISO alignment. I can't think of the right word. So this is one way in which you could go about doing that. So this is your plan. These are who is going to be running your tests. These are the requirements that those tests are going to cover. And you could just use the print button up here to print that out ahead of time and send that off to any stakeholders that need to see it. And equally, once those tests have actually been executed, you can do much the same thing. From a reporting perspective, obviously, you know, things are likely to be a little bit more complex than what I've done here for example purposes in terms of the number of requirements that are being covered. But as I touched on during the webinar, you can use these views to then generate reports. So if I want to see my requirements coverage, I can go into this summary for references report, or I can use a comparison for references report, and that's going to give me information about the references that have been covered off during the course of my testing. And I can also configure my reports to show additional information as well. So we've got a run summary up here with tester and references as well, and that gives me information about, you know, who tested, what requirements were covered and things like that as well. So hopefully that addresses most of the questions that were sent over to us prior to the webinar about that stuff. If it doesn't, then, you know, please do feel free to reach out to our support team for some more information about how exactly you can configure TestRail to get the information that you need. Jacob, I think we've got time for maybe one more question.
Okay. Let's see here. 1 second. I totally lost my spot here. Hold on one moment. Here's a good question. A colleague prefers to organize functionality by test suite rather than test folder, and I prefer the opposite. Are there pros or cons for either approach?
Test suite and what? Sorry, what was the alternative?
I imagine it's kind of the merits between the two different project types of like a single repository using sections versus using test suites, and what the benefits of those would be.
Well, it's kind of like keeping things in separate separate rooms in your house versus just keeping everything in one room, isn't it? If you split up all of your tests, your cases into separate suites, then that's certainly a valid way of organizing things. But you run the risk of some of those cases not being as accessible to other areas of the project if you should need them. So it just makes life a little bit more complicated, to be honest. I would tend to lean towards just using a single repository project and organizing cases by section according to functionality or component, as I already mentioned, just because it's the most flexible approach. It means everything is accessible within that project whenever you need it, and it's pretty sustainable over the long haul as well, so long as you're organizing your cases according to how your product functions. That's my response anyway. We're over time, so I'm going to draw things to a close. Thank you, Jacob, for pitching in there. Thank you, everybody, for joining the webinar. There's lots more webinars over the course of the next couple of weeks. So I'm back here tomorrow with a Meet TestRail webinar. I think, Jacob, you're here on Thursday with a slightly more comprehensive demonstration webinar. And then we have a TestRail 6.6 release webinar a week today as well, I believe. So if you want any more information or you want to just sign up for those webinars, please go to our webinars page on the website. And if you haven't already done so, please do give TestRail a try. Thanks everybody for joining. See you at the next one. Bye-bye.